Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. I myself feel a bit composed and is least disposed to enter into an academic exercise. But nevertheless, I'll have to do that since the paper is a bit discursive in nature and strictly philosophical. At the outset, I am grateful to the organizers to have invited me to present this paper. Friends, this morning I wish to speak on the epistemic underpinnings of Sri Gurudev Dr. Ranade's philosophy. As you all know, before we set on to build a philosophical castle, we should showcase the epistemic foundations upon which we plan to raise the superstructure, the epistemic methods that one chooses for his building the superstructure. So this inquiry into the epistemic foundations takes primacy, in fact, over even the content, because these epistemic tools would determine the scope and limits of the philosophical journey that you are planning to undertake. There's a misconception that it is the modernity that has brought this priority for determining the methods prior to the philosophical exercise. That's not the case. In fact, all the philosophical traditions across the globe, be it Chinese, Indian, Japanese, African, all of them insist on this need to prefix the epistemic tools prior to entering into philosophy. As in the case in Indian philosophy, we say that pramanadhinaha prameya sthitihi. Before we get into the prameya, we need to have a good look at the pramanas, the tools, as it were, that are picked up, which we find congenial to assist us in our scholarly endeavor in philosophy. Friends, in this presentation, we shall examine Sri R.D. Ranade's chosen epistemic methods and how he used them wisely to achieve his set target. Now, what was his set target? What is it that he wanted to build on? As you all know, while even building a structure, a concrete structure, we will have a plan, as it were. Before getting into praising the foundations, we will have a good look at the plan. So what was his plan? Going by the Vedantic tradition, Gurudev is clear that the goal of human life is to redeem oneself from suffering. An inquiry on the cause of suffering. What is the cause of suffering, first of all? Reveals that we set aside the true self and go behind the ephemeral. Swamiji was speaking a bit on the metaphysical exercises. To understand, as he has rightly said, that the micro is indeed the macro. So the absolute reality, look for the absolute reality beyond what is ephemeral, what we seem to experience. So Professor Ranade, Gurudev Ranade, this metaphysical inquiry takes precedence over all other things. It takes precedence over the epistemic methods one devises, the ethical behavior that one adopts, and the aesthetic experience that she may beget. All are derivative from this primary metaphysical inquiry. For him, metaphysics was the first philosophy. So this way of setting the metaphysical goals prior to the epistemic endeavor has not been approved by his modern Western counterparts, but he did not bother much. Of course, he knew that convincing the West on the philosophical depth of our thought was a pressing challenge for him. But equally pressing mission for him was to rejuvenate Indian philosophy. So friends, as I see it, Gurudev was engaged in waging a war at two fronts. One against the Western intimidation of Indian thought and another against the native resistance to update our thought. To accomplish this dual goal, Gurudev has used a handful of tools, and let us have a quick look at them. Let's begin with the comparative method. The most prominent method as it appears. It's actually a farce. It's not that he subscribed all his life for the comparative method. Apparently, it looks as if it is the most prominent one. He was convinced that to make Upanishadic philosophy intelligible to the Western mind, we must borrow their own prominent tool, namely reason. He knew pretty well that he is trying to do the impossible, using reason to speak that which necessarily transcends the boundaries of reason. But he had no option. We find him drawing parallels between Ilang Vital of Bergson with Aruni's story, which has been specified in Chandogya 6.2, where he speaks about a great organic force. So he pretty well realized that there is very little commonalities between Bergson's Ilang Vital and Aruni's great organic force. And he very quickly clarifies that the latter, that is what has been specified in Chandogya, is more internal and spiritualized. So therefore, even as he drew parallels between the two traditions, he visioned Upanishadic thought as transcending these Western thoughts, which promotes one or the other ideal, while in the Upanishads we have a conglomeration of methods such as solipsism, idealism, realism, and phenomenalism. I'm quoting Gurudev. All that we find in contemporary philosophy at one stretch. And friends, today we may evaluate this comparative method as a defensive game, but we should roll back ourselves to the times that Gurudev lived and slip into his own shoes. In fact, if you read his paper, A Vindication of Philosophy, yesterday I was reading that, it speaks volumes about the pain of defending a native thought. He is pained that he has to speak a lot in order to defend his native thought. That too, he was defending Indian philosophy against another Indian, Hriday Lal, if I remember the name right, who has all contemptuous words for Indian philosophy. Note that the comparative mode which was adopted by the majority of schools of his clan compelled them to engage in argumentation, a kind of argumentation as appealing to the West. This has been done by Radhakrishnan, all of them, all the Indian philosophers who wrote during the colonial and the immediate post-colonial period. Setting aside the traditional goals of Vada, argumentation was the prime method of philosophizing in this country since the time of Gautama's Nyaya Sutra. That is, what was the basic goal of argumentation? That is philosophical promotion and inter-school fertilizing. They pretty well knew that this comparative method had only limited philosophical goals, but they still resorted to it primarily to empower the native thinking, to resist the onslaught of modernity. As you all know, modernity was trying to wipe off all that is native in the Oriental tradition. Not only India, all the Asian countries have suffered this. So for this, they were forced to engage in dialogue with the Western philosophy on Christianity, science, and even humanism, which is a product of modernity. But at the heart, they knew that what was needed was to continue the inter-school exchanges and dialogues, which would take Indian philosophy ahead, which alone would take Indian philosophy ahead. So this echoes in his writings, where he vows that what is needed is not the comparative method, but a constructive method. Now, while addressing the text, so this was his approach towards the other. Now, what was his approach to the self, his own thought? While addressing the text, what was his tool? Was it that he was using sheer analysis, or did he prefer interpretation? From his writings, it is evident that he did not resort to interpretative method much. Hermeneutics was not his cup of tea. He says he would rather go straight to the text rather than the traditional way of viewing them through the eyes of the later Vedantic schools. We have the habit of reading Prasthanatrayas through the bhashyas of any of the three schools. He observes, I quote him, "We who stand for no dogma in particular, I'm not particularly an Advaitin or a Vishishtadvaitin, and therefore we know how to understand the Upanishadic passages straight and not to press the passages into the service of any particular view to which we may be committed." For him, fidelity of the original text was so great, and he says that let these interpreters not father their own ideas upon the text they see. He belonged to that school of hermeneutics. You have two different schools which give primacy of the text and to place the text in the context. The author might have been very creative, as in the case of Shankara or the other Bhashyakaras. They might have been very creative in interpretation, but one has to be truthful to the text, says Gurudev. He preferred going by the natural interpretation, where the straight meaning would lead him to. I'm reminded of Swami Vivekananda's criticism of Shankara's Gita Bhashya, wherein he says that Shankara twists several terms of Bhagavad Gita in order to make it fit for his Advaita doctrine. Borrowing Swami Vivekananda's words, Gurudev seems to be saying that Shankara is dear to us, but truth is dearer. To be fair to the text, you need to take the philological tool in hand. So, philological method seems to be yet another method that he has adopted. For him, philological concerns should be equally taken care of as the philosophical ones while attending to the text. A combination of philology and philosophy would help us to provide an intelligible interpretation of the Upanishads. As a typical Indian philosopher, he was very sensitive to language, as all Indian philosophers are. As we all know that language is the foundation. While for the Greek tradition, it is mathematics that pays the foundation, for India, it is the language. Language is the subtle form. In Sri Harsha in Khandana Khandakadya says that language itself is Maya. So anyway, let me not enter into that. So language plays a significant role in our philosophizing. So he was sensitive to language and its patencies. He used to coin new words. Yesterday there was a mention of that. If words are not capable of conveying the meaning that he wanted, for instance, synonym to indicate the sound aspect of the name of God Nama, and spiriton to refer to the spirit as a secular term that can be commonly used by both neuroscience and philosophy. These are some of the examples. Now, his discomfort in using the comparative method is released by adopting the cultural method. He realizes that many Western thinkers go wrong in understanding the text because they take a culturally extrinsic approach. He points out how Hurtle fails in understanding while relating the episode of Uma and Indra in Kenopanishad, wherein Hurtle seems to be saying that if you read the episode, it will be clear that you don't need a preceptor to attain self-realization. And Sri Ranade counters this. He says Hurtle seems to be forgetting the fact that Uma has been performing precisely the task of a spiritual leader, showing the pathway to God like a lamppost. Here, Ranade seems to echo G.C. Pandey's view that these texts will not reveal themselves to those who are culturally extrinsic. See, all these Western ideologies seem to be taking an extrinsic view of the text, and therefore they are unable to get into the original meaning or the genuine meaning of the text. Also, the European understanding that all was pessimism and sorrow in Indian thought before the days of Tagore in India, and it was Tagore who brought the evangel joy and bliss from the West, is also rooted in this cultural extrinsic approach. He beautifully says, isn't it naive to depict a thought pessimistic which teaches the doctrine of bliss as Upanishads do? Again, how the world which pierced by Brahman through and through be pessimistic at all? Because God is immanent in this world. Tagore's philosophy of joy and bliss is only the crust wave of the ocean of blissful existence depicted in the Upanishads, because it's only a scratch of what the Upanishads have been telling us. And again, respect for tradition also figures well in his cultural method. Shankara says, Shastra Vidobi Asampradaya Vida, Shastra Vidobi Murghavad Upekshaniya, because tradition plays a significant role in our understanding of philosophy. I'm quoting Gurudev, wherein he says, I quote, unless we are born in a spiritual tradition, nothing spiritual is likely to accrue to us. It is only through a lineal descent from a spiritual saint that we can hope to have some kind of spiritual experience. Now, coming to the ethical method, does he adopt an ethical method at all? I would rather give an assent as well as a dissent. It's both yes and no. Of course, Gurudev makes efforts to convince the West about the ethical leanings of Indian thought, particularly Upanishads. He argues out that Upanishads are not silent on the well-being of the other. What else is the Isha 7th mantra, Yasmin Sarvani Bhudani Atmaiva Bhud Vichanata, say, other than the concern for the other? But ethics according to him, as I have already made it clear, that metaphysics is the first philosophy for him. And ethics is only a byproduct of this metaphysics. And he also underscored, but very significantly, like a true Indian, he underscores the additional responsibility of philosophers to be the lamppost for others. If you want to call it as ethical, call it ethical. It has been traditionally held that, see, all laymen cannot understand the Shastras, particularly the Shruti Granthas. And therefore, we traditionally say that we may resort to the path carved by the wise. And therefore, the wise men should be very careful that they lead a life of exemplary kind. Lord Krishna in Bhagavad Gita says, Arjuna, that you being the leader of the society should become a model for others. He says, Yadyat acharati shreshtha tatadeva idaro janaha sayat pramanam gurute lokaha tad anuvartade. Therefore, the responsibility is on our shoulders to lead an exemplary life. Sri Aurobindo also says that God possessed should be the standard in doing our duties, because everyone will not be able to discern the Swadharma and Paradharma. So we follow the path of the wise. Akil Bilgrami, I would like to speak at length on it, but then the time doesn't permit. Akil Bilgrami locates this virtue of leading an exemplary life in Mahatma Gandhi. He is one who insists on leading an exemplary life in the modernity. Now, coming to the method of praxis, a couple of his thoughts and dispositions. Yesterday, I was listening to the presidential address, which was so dynamic, and wherein he was trying to speak how our thoughts are to be necessarily translated into action. And Gurudev precisely spoke about this. A couple of his thoughts and dispositions lead us to think that he subscribed to the pragmatic method. While he's holding mystic realization of divinity as the ultimate goal, he was doing all these philosophical exercises and discursive thinking, but he had a pragmatic goal, that is God realization. That is the prime indication that he was a pragmatist. But there are additional dispositions that I would like to highlight. One is his adoration to emperors like Ashoka and Akbar, men of praxis. And, he dares to keep them at par with acharyas like Shankara, which is a very daring attempt. That itself reveals that he has great adoration for converting theories into practice. Also note that he was an institution builder. To think is to act for him, a beautiful convergence of thought, word, and deed, which is rarely seen these days. Somewhere, very interesting, I was almost laughing when he apologetically observes that Upanishads do not have direct practical implications. And that was taken up by the Bhagavad Gita. See, why he made this assertion is that a theory is for praxis for him. Now, let me come to the mystic method, which is the prime method that he has been employing. For Ranade, experience is the touchstone of valid knowledge. He said sheer experience. Now he is going to qualify the experience. What we feel, realize, and experience should alone constitute our philosophy. Immediate experience of reality is more important than a discursive knowledge about it. But unlike James, now William James also speaks about sensation as primary, but this immediate experience is about the sensual experience. But Gurudev is speaking about the intuitive experience, or what is called anubhuti. There's a great difference between the intellectual conviction of God's omnipresence. We can discuss hours and hours, argue out cases on the intellectual conviction of God's omnipresence, but a mystical vision of Him is totally different. The mystical view of reality alone would enable us to reconcile all the three faculties in us. This is very important. In the mystical method, the other faculties are carried over. Nothing is being discarded. The emotional, the volitional, and the intellectual, all these are carried over when you go to the mystical. In a way, his entire writing, as I see it, it's struggle to read his literature, because today we do our philosophies because we live in a country where we know what our philosophies are. We don't have to be defensive. But those days, particularly during the colonial period and the the period in which the post-independent period, where philosophers are struggling to convince the other. And in a way, his entire writing is dedicated to place mysticism on a truly philosophical basis. Mysticism, he believed, would give every doctrine its place in the scheme of universe, as I've said. Mystic, he says, is at par with empiricists. He says, actually he was far ahead of his Western counterparts on philosophy of religion. I'll show that. So mystic, he says, is at par with empiricists, for both seem to underscore the primacy of experience, and empiricists also underscore the primary of experience. So is the case with mystic, with this difference that their objects are different. For the empiricists, it is the concrete object, while for the mystic, it is the divinity. In this, he anticipates the argument of Alvin Plantinga, a contemporary philosopher of religion, who argues that, quite like sense experience, the immediate experience of the mystics should also be considered foundational, a basic idea that needs no justification. You know that in knowledge claims, you need to place justifications for your knowledge claims. But if you have a basic idea, you don't have to provide justification for that. That I see a laptop before me is an immediate awareness, essential awareness, for which I don't have to place any justification. Now, if that has been accepted, the empiricist claim, then Plantinga says that even a mystic who has a visual experience of the subtle divinity should be accepted as a basic idea which demands no justification. Now, this mystical vision is intuitive, but this intuition is not the Bergsonian intuition, which deals with things under the aspect of time. Bergsonian intuition is temporal in nature, while mystic intuition is transcendental across time. Again, though immediacy is common for both the Bergsonian intuition as well as Gurudev's intuition, while Bergsonian intuition involves a pre-logical immediacy, mysticism is post-logical immediacy. He is of the view that, this is where he distinguishes the interpretative method and the original text. He is of the view that Upanishads have followed the intuitive method, while the Vedantic schools, the interpreters, the Bhashyakaras, have adopted the logical method. And he says he finds no worries with logic. He says that they are not two mutually exclusive methods, with this difference that logic is subsumptive of the intuitive. Intuitive carries over logic. And he says Upanishadic teaching must be compared rather to the writings of the Sufis and the Christian mystics like Eckhart than with that of hardcore philosophers like Immanuel Kant. Intuition comprises within itself the intellectual, the emotional, and the volitional aspects. The intellectual aspect involves the knowledge of the God, the emotional aspect, love for him, and the will aspect, desire for the union of him. And this is precisely how he carries over the bhakti also along with his intuitive notion. Bhakti has not been discarded, it has been taken off. And in this, he has some similarity. He bears some similarities with Ramanuja's method, though I don't have time. If there are questions, I'll answer. So interestingly, to speak about the progressive method, this is where he departs from the standard Vedantins. Interestingly, Gurudev seems to adopt a progressive method of approximation to divinity. Now, this approximation method or the progressive method has the advantage of steering clear of both the evils of pride of perfection. Jivan Mukta will have the pride of perfection. Sorry, I do not mean that Jivan Muktas will be proud, but that, this kind of attainment that is off, and also the fear of non-attainment. You are not trying to reach, but then you are not reaching that goal. Because if there is a progressive method, you think or you realize that you have been progressing consistently. In epistemology, there is approximation to divine self-consciousness as truth itself. The more one knows Brahman, the more one becomes it. Brahmavid Brahmaiva Bhavati. You know that the knowing and the being are mutually dependent. As you know, you become. As you become, you know. They are mutually causal in fact. And this progressive method permits you to get closer to the Brahman as you know more and more about the Brahman. Note that this doctrine of approximation is not in tune with Advaita. He acknowledges this and says that Gaudapada does not accept the doctrine of grades and degrees of reality, nor Shankara, which is a compromise between realism and idealism. Yeah. Now, I'll quickly speak about rational mysticism. Can I have 5 minutes? Now he says, rational mysticism has been the topic of discussion throughout a study. He says he is subscribing to a kind of mysticism called rational mysticism. Modern philosophers have had a closed approach towards mysticism. It's usually dubbed as rationalism and ridiculed as unscientific and occult. Rational mysticism, he says, may be regarded as contradiction in terms, but it is only truism. It's truism because there is anyway reason involved in it. His doctrine of rational mysticism is far from inactivity, but rather it is dynamic in nature. Now, quite like mysticism, sensation is also an immediacy, as I've already told you. And between these two types of immediacy, on one you have the sensation, which is immediate, and then you have the discursive thinking, which is rational, and then you march towards another immediacy, which is intuitive. So this type of the discursive thinking alone permits you to explain the object as in relational nature with other things. That is, an object as that and what characteristics. The other two immediacies will not be able to connect things with each other. The difference between these two types of intuition is this. While the lower immediacy has not yet reached the rational stage, the higher immediacy has transcended it. This is not to belittle reason, but rather to carry over reason and show that reason has due role. That reason has limitations is an accepted norm across the traditions. Quite like a physician who is able to treat everyone else but cannot treat himself, reason is unable to know its limits. Wittgenstein's ladder analogy is relevant here. As you climb up, you don't carry the ladder on your shoulders, you drop the ladder. Similarly, you will have to realize the instrumentality of reason and drop that instrument. To transcend the lower, to borrow the Hegelian dictum, is not to ignore it, but to pass through it to destinations beyond its reach, beyond the reach of reason. Now, what is unique of Sri Ranade's rational mysticism is that reason is once again invited to analyze the mystical experience. It probes into the nature and criteria of mystical experience and to discern true mysticism from superstitions. He was worried about it because he was insistent that his mysticism, which he calls rational mysticism, should be distinguished from occultism. And mysticism, when aided by reason, discards its esoteric nature. His rational mysticism could challenge everyone to test the validity of mystical experience. Here we may suspect that Ranade is trying to delimit the supra-rational level to the rational level, but he's not doing that. And he warns us that as long as religion engages concepts, it cannot rule out the play of reason. Reason may not be available to validate neither the object of experience, that is the divine, nor the immediate experience of the mystic, but it can and rather must function in and around the area. Reason should prevail there. Reason should remain there. As he rightly points out, mystical experience may not admit of definition, but still it can be discussed. Quite like how a blind tries to read through the braille, the reason, which is not endowed with intuitive vision, tries to, though minimally, see, reason cannot read mystical experience, but it tries to minimally experience and comprehend it. In brief, rational mysticism is 1 degree removed from mystical experience. It is ineffable, you cannot speak about it, but still you try to discuss it, you try to understand it. The ripeness of reason prepare the base from where the intuition takes its flight. Reason in turn receives illumination from, see, where is it that the reason is set aside? You keep getting saving experiences, indicating the reason that here you stay, you cannot travel further. Thus, intuition has come to fulfill and not to destroy reason. A rational analysis of mystical experience isolate that which is unnamed. As you proceed through the rational exercise, you realize that there are certain things unnamed which it cannot open up. But this isolation itself makes us aware that beyond the sphere of reason, there is a vast arena where reason is forbidden to enter and where the intuition is the only guide. But if reason had not done any preliminary work, if you choose to keep reason outside, warns Gurudev, mysticism would be only unbroken silence. Reason is endowed with the function of awakening the self, guiding and evoking it, and leads you to the door and then bows and withdraws because reason cannot move further. Another way of understanding rational mysticism is by taking intuitive knowledge. He says jnana. He says jnana is not empirical knowledge, but rather illumination, where the whole is picked up first. The whole, the idea, the general is being picked up first, and the parts next. In our routine understanding, we understand an object in terms of the part. But in the intuitive understanding, you first take the whole and then move to the part, unlike the ordinary understanding, which progresses from parts to the whole. To sum up, these methods have become flexible tools. See, I have presented a handful of tools that Gurudev has used, and he has used them in a very flexible fashion, and they were very flexible in his hands to raise his edifice of mystic realization of the divine. This is, according to him, is the unique philosophy of India. As he has said, I'm repeating, in Upanishads you have multiple methods that has been set aside, multiple tools as well. If India will rise, she will rise in a peculiar way, not hitherto known to history. She will combine the virtues of the East and the West and will rise superior to both. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.